We need a completely different, much more radical agenda as societies for how we want to manage the technology that we are all racing to build now. The tech on its own is not going to save us.
Are you saying that's okay, we just need to build some policies and regulation around it? Or are you saying if we're not careful, we're going to be sort of over the cliff before we know it?
I think we're heading over the cliff right now. You could not have picked a worse time for the arrival of the most powerful technology in history. And I am well aware of the dysfunctional elite dynamics that are partly responsible for why we are in the mess we're in today.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast where we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. We're often told that technology will solve our biggest problems, that more data, more innovation and smarter machines will create a better future for us all. But the alarm bells are ringing too. My guest today is Dex Hunter-Torricke, a former advisor to some of the most powerful figures in Silicon Valley. He's worked at Google, Facebook, SpaceX, and others, helping shape the messages of tech leaders as they've promised to transform our lives. Then he quit. And now through his think tank, the Center for Tomorrow, he's questioning the tech revolution and warning the systems we're building may be taking us down very dangerous roads. Dex, welcome.
Great to be here.
If you could change the world and save us, what would you do?
I would say we need a completely different, much more radical agenda as societies for how we want to manage the technology that we are all racing to build now. The tech on its own is not going to save us. We need to fundamentally transform our economies, our societies, our institutions if we truly want to get to a good future. That is not the path we're on.
What do you mean by an agenda? I mean, do you mean government plans or?
It's something that you both need governments and industries and communities to have a vision of what kind of people and world do we actually want to be as we see the arrival of the most powerful technology in history. Right now, we have a tremendous amount of detail and a huge amount of investment in simply building the technology, the infrastructure, the hundreds of billions being spent every year now by big tech on data centers and so on. There's very little understanding of what is actually going to happen to our societies. And when I say agenda, I mean literally it's got to start with a conversation about what are the choices in front of us, how are we actually planning to deploy that technology to dislodge many of the rising social, economic, political crises that are already here. And I think, in a way, that is very much the focus of everything I'm doing now. It is questioning what is the plan and the wrapper around all of that technology which is coming our way. There's very little I think you can do to actually stop that huge wave of technology, but actually there is a tremendous amount we can do to actually begin transforming our institutions, our thinking, our strategies, which we're going to need for every part of our society, every industry, every organization. Very little effort's been made to actually do those things.
So at the moment, pretty much every organization is saying, well, we ought to start using AI and working out how we can use it, and let's just get our people using it and see what they can do with it. And then they're discovering what they can do with it, and they're discovering the savings they can make, and how easy certain things are and how difficult other things are. And this is evolving very, very quickly. Are you saying that's okay, we just need to build some policies and regulation around it? Or are you saying if we're not careful, we're going to be sort of over the cliff before we know it?
I think we're heading over the cliff right now. And in a way, like the perfect example of how this is going wrong right now, Meta is one of the biggest AI labs in the world. They're spending tens of billions on their AI plans every year now. You've got all of our futures on the line, and you think, wow, I've built this amazing multi-billion-dollar technology. I've got the engine of a Ferrari, but I've done very little to actually, prepare the chassis. We're jamming it into a 1980s, Skoda, and hoping that that's somehow going to become a supercar. And when it's extended to, economies, societies, our jobs, these are, choices we're making now in how we deploy tech that will have devastating impacts on people's lives and on communities. Companies like Meta are at the forefront of the tech, and they're just winging it. And that is exactly the same level of dysfunction we're going to see across lots of other companies, lots of other, communities.
Now, you've worked for some of these big tech giants. You've worked for Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg at Meta. It is tempting to start seeing these guys as Bond villains. How awful are they? From someone who's worked alongside them.
I think Elon was tweeting that he wants to get a volcano lair. So, I mean, literally, it is easy to think of them as Bond villains. Some of them seem to enjoy reveling in, this sort of image that they've become untouchable politically, that they have this enormous influence over our lives. These are leaders who I think are deeply problematic. They have evolved over the last decade from being characters who at one point in time were genuinely hopeful. You can dismiss anyone who thought that, including myself, as just utterly foolish now. But at one point, there was a moment of excitement about what these technologies, the things that people were building, could truly do for humanity. And these were leaders who actually used words like humanity. I started my career at the UN. I went to work in Silicon Valley, at the start of, one tech boom, because, of course, technology became very clearly apparent as a central motor of progress in our societies. But these are all leaders now who, over the last decade, have taken on really problematic value sets, views of the world, ways of intertwining themselves with the interests of the US political administration. And I think these are people who simply don't represent the values that matter to most people in the world and to our country and many other countries around the world.
And do you think they have changed? I mean, it was tempting to think 10 years ago or more that Silicon Valley was full of sort of liberal, sort of slightly lefty American idealists who wanted to make the world a better place. Was that ever true? Or were they always what they really are and are revealing themselves to be now?
This is a question I ask myself all the time. I know many of these folks deeply. I worked with them for years. Were they lying to me then about the things they cared about? Or are they lying now, masquerading as something else? I don't know. In a lot of ways, I don't have time for the psychodrama. Either way, these are folks who have chosen at the zenith of their power now with, essentially unlimited money, tremendous influence, companies that connect billions of people. They have chosen to no longer stand up for the values and things they were talking about 10 years ago, which were all about humanity, solving our social and economic challenges, using technology in ways that serve the entire world. And so, I think it's very, very hard to discern what is authentic anymore from these folks, which is part of the reason I think these companies have become so widely disliked. They have technology that is ubiquitous but unloved. And that is a very dangerous strategic position for them to be in as well. I think their actual political and reputational strategies are absolutely bonkers. And this is not 4D chess they're playing. They are laying the foundations for a massive backlash against what they're building.
I mean, did you feel personally let down? Did you have a sort of a moment of awakening? I mean, you're not an engineer, are you? You're sort of a messaging, policy, comms person. Did you feel you went and you had a sort of an awakening moment where you thought, this is not what I thought?
Absolutely. And, Silicon Valley has for many years, for generations, it has pulled in many different workers from lots of different backgrounds, lots of communities all over the world who are drawn to a vision of advancing humanity by building different things. And we were all drawn, to this place because we believed in a mission, at different companies, in different technologies, that could truly be something inclusive for the world. And we've now ended up in something which is deeply nationalist, ultra short-sighted, appears to be mainly driven by just juicing the stock market valuations of a tiny sliver of companies. And I feel personally betrayed by that. I had certainly no interest in going to work for companies that are purely interested in enriching themselves at the expense of the entire world and completely giving up on their responsibilities towards society. And for me, Zuckerberg is actually, I think, the biggest betrayal, because there's somebody who literally talked about the value of connecting the world, and he chose to reinvent himself as a person who literally just does cage fights and wears a bunch of gold chains and decides that he wants to be positioned as somebody who is into MMA. He's a bro. And after sitting atop a set of social networks that connect billions of people, that have clearly become deeply problematic in our societies, have huge, unintended consequences on young people and our mental health and so on, that's the biggest responsibility he thought that he could take on as the leader of that company. I mean, it's absolutely wild.
So when Meta say we acknowledge our mistakes and we're going to change the way we behave, which is what they say, how should we read that?
Show me the proof. All these companies came up with a very clever messaging angle. I know, because I was part of it.
You were doing it.
Yeah. And they say, we'd love regulation. And sure, that is what you should say. And the companies know that regulation is unavoidable. So of course they say that. It's a sort of meaningless promise unless you can turn it into something truly real. And what exactly are Meta or any of these big tech companies actually promising to do differently? What have they actually transformed which is going to have a real impact on the tidal wave of problems that we're facing now? I mean, when it comes to online safety in the UK, right, we've had so many disasters, so many tragedies that have unfolded. And there's very little evidence now that the company's actually done anything to really change the way it operates. Actually, they've simply decimated their content moderation infrastructure. They've chosen to do less, management of these issues. They've done all sorts of things to try and stoke, more divisive voices on these platforms. I don't believe it.
Right. So, you mentioned the changes in this country. I mean, in the last week, the government has announced taking kids off social media, and the tech companies all say, well, we'll do whatever you want. Again, you were part of how they would respond to these things publicly. What's really going on? When they say, yes, we'll work within any regulatory framework, we're very happy with regulation. What are they really thinking?
I think they're realizing they can make that open-ended promise, which they've been making for years, but you're dealing with a context in which you have a very weak government, which is going through political turmoil. You're dealing with nations that are at the mercy of a US administration that has become intertwined with the interests of Silicon Valley and will go to bat for the interests of Silicon Valley. We've got an online safety bill. It took years to pass it. It established a whole content moderation infrastructure at Ofcom. Why is it that we have the scale of problems that we're facing? Because, in fact, the system is not really being enforced. Because, in fact, the US administration essentially threatened massive reprisals on the UK and other nations who would actually try to moderate the voices, the platforms that Washington cares about. And so we're at the subject of a whole geopolitical agenda coming from Washington. If you're a tech company, all you've got to do is keep mouthing the same platitudes and know it is very unlikely that decision makers are truly going to summon the political will to actually transform this agenda and take on Washington.
How have they gone about persuading the political establishment that they are, well, first of all, they're not responsible for the content that is on. They're not like TV stations where we are responsible for what we broadcast. They are somehow not. And that they are in some way sort of too big to really change, to really regulate, that you can't change the algorithm. Is all of that sort of true? Or is it just a sort of a myth that they have managed to persuade politicians of, that politicians are basically powerless when it comes to the internet?
So I definitely don't believe politicians are powerless when it comes to the internet. I think politicians have made huge mistakes, of course. The online safety bill was deeply problematic in lots of ways. It thought about solving these problems purely or mainly in terms of what those platforms could do to tinker with their algorithmic machinery. There are things that the companies should be doing which they're not, clearly are failures of the companies. But if you truly want to turn off that tidal wave of disinformation, if you want to deal with the massive reservoir of hate that is bubbling up within societies, we've got to have a much more holistic agenda to tackle that. There is a reason that there are millions of people prepared to believe disinformation in the first place, who are so angry that they support nationalists and far-right movements. There is very little concerted effort or political leadership which is truly working to remove those sources of hatred. And so, in a way, the tech companies have been in a position where they can actually rightly say, you're not doing the work it takes to turn off that reservoir of hate, but it also has been an environment in which they have evaded their own responsibilities.
Yes, I mean, they've managed to put it on us, haven't they? I mean, if you talk to any of these tech companies, they will say, well, we've got lots of tools that you can use to filter your content, turn off stuff that you don't want, to protect your children. We've done our bit.
I mean, that's also a thing where it just simply defies the reality of how people actually use platforms. Sure, you can build in tools and controls because you're forced to, or because you're trying to counter the potential, PR fallout. If the tools are so difficult to use, if they actually are things where you never teach anybody how to have, media literacy or social media literacy, if you actually actively work to try and undermine, some of the, thinking which really maps the effects of social media on young people's brains, for example, then, it's sort of a meaningless gesture again. Like, we have to look at the real reality of how the tools are being used.
I mean, how sophisticated are they at having sort of policy teams, lobbying? I mean, A generation ago, you probably wouldn't have gone to work for tech. You'd have probably gone into think tanks and politics and policy and all of that to change the world, if that's what you really wanted to do.
That's right.
Your generation then went into tech. And the other ones are, there's a lot of money around these departments, isn't there?
I mean, I was the first speechwriter at Google and also at Facebook, back when it was still called Facebook. And it was such a nascent, machinery, that they were building there, to shape reputation, to think about the societal impacts of tech. They didn't even know where to put me the first time I went to Google. They put me on the product team at first. They just thought they'd jam me onto a random organization. And so, these are companies which, I often think because the 21st century in a connected world has unfolded so quickly, we often forget how young these firms are. In the space of just, a couple of decades, they have built a level of influence and infrastructure and products that have achieved a scale we have never seen in history. The fact that, SpaceX, which obviously just went public in the last few days, there's a company there which is accounting for about 90% of the entire orbital launches in the world. They completely dwarfed every national space program and the tremendous amount of investment that's poured into that, including from superpowers. So, all of these companies now, they are doing something very, very novel in history. They have, of course, acquired huge teams, very well resourced, the most expensive lobbying operations, in history. In many cases, though, the kind of people you'd get to staff those kind of programs, veterans of US presidential campaigns and congressional politics, they're not the people you'd get to think deeply and thoughtfully about the true societal ramifications. They're an excellent damage control team. In many cases, these are folks who actually, they are there purely to defend the company. And in a way, I never thought of myself as a comms person. I certainly had no interest in being a spin doctor. For me, my father was a refugee. I grew up in, poverty in the UK. Our family was very working class. I was the first person to get a degree in my family. I was always drawn to this societal mission of tech because for me, it was a personal journey in a way. But there are other people who just think, wow, this is a way to get rich.
I suppose I have to ask you, have you just got rich? If you were at SpaceX and they've just floated, are you one of the multimillionaires?
I did very well in my time in Silicon Valley, and I employ all those resources now to literally fight for a completely different vision of how we should manage that technology. And of course, I was at Facebook and Google as well, and...
So you are proudly biting the hand that fed you?
I am. And put it this way. When I walked out of SpaceX, I left a week after the 2016 election. I decided on election night 2016, when Trump was declared the victor, that I was going to get out of there. I was definitely not going to be the right mouthpiece for a company that was going to be having to do deals with the Trump administration. I gave up about $100 million in stock to walk out the door, and I happily do it again.
So when you say we're heading over the cliff, what do you mean? We are used to talking about threats to jobs. Do you think we are actually realizing what the real threat is?
I do not think that we are preparing at all at the scale or with the urgency we need to ensure that this country has a strong, growing economy and that young people and the next generation have opportunities a decade from now. We're facing an environment already right now where you've got the worst labor market in a long time. Youth unemployment is obviously soaring. You've got more than 1 million people between 18 and 24 who are not in education or employment. We saw the Milburn report recently. The numbers conceal the extent to which we are already in a massive economic crisis. Lots of people are employed. Are they employed in jobs that are actually making use of their skills, that are giving them growth opportunities in life, that make them happy? There's polling out there which shows the vast majority of UK workers hate their jobs. They don't even moderately dislike them. They hate their jobs. And then we wonder, why does this country have some of the longest working hours in Europe and some of the worst productivity out of the advanced economies? That's before advanced AI shows up. And the entire promise of this technology, this is literally why big tech is plowing more than $650 billion into AI infrastructure this year alone. They realize they're about to build technology that is likely to surpass the cognitive performance of the average worker. That's the whole point of artificial general intelligence. And in that future, you can do much more with much less. Organizations are going to become much, much smaller, and a very small number of people will be the winners economically in that future, and they will run away with most of the rewards.
So you do think we're looking at mass unemployment?
Yes, I do.
And so when I spoke to Jack Clark from Anthropic, he was saying, well, he was also warning, these things are always possible. That's their business model, is to sort of warn of how bad things could be and say, you need to regulate, you need to change taxation systems. He was sort of suggesting, well, we could live in a world in which you have to massively tax a small number of tech companies to pay for everybody who isn't going to have a job, or for retraining is how they put it. Didn't sound very realistic to me. I mean, are they being honest?
I think they are being honest, and it's not realistic. And this is part of why I left big tech, and I'm now focused on the things I'm doing now. We have to come up with a sober, realistic agenda that can be truly implemented to figure out how to provide a good quality of life for most people, because we are missing that critical part of solving the future. And here's the thing, no single country, including the superpowers, is going to come up with an answer to this on their own. Certainly there is nothing that the UK can do on its own to get to an economic model or a future which is able to provide the kind of resources that would allow you to provide, for example, a universal basic income, to have that level of taxation on those small number of companies. These are all companies which are accruing enormous economic and political power now, and they're not British firms. How do you propose to actually, access, the resources you need from these folks you want to tax, especially when the effects of AI will crash on societies all over the world? Every other government's going to be lining up saying, where's my cut of it too? So in fact, you need an agenda that is international from the start, where lots of countries who know that they're going to be at the mercy of US and Chinese, deep tech over the next decade, they get together and say, this is not a future that's going to work for us on the path we're on. How do we get leverage in this future to come up with an equitable solution?
But that is the thing that has been totally eroded over the course of my lifetime. The world in which international governments would get together and try and come up with sets of rules, or even tackling the 2008 financial crisis was probably the last time anything like that was really attempted. It's all gone. There is no cooperation.
That's right.
There are no structures. International law is flouted and ignored routinely. The UN is on its knees. We're in a terrible position to do any of this.
That's right. You could not have picked a worse time for the arrival of the most powerful technology in history. And in a way, after nearly 20 years of being in rooms with leaders from governments and these companies, I am well aware of the dysfunctional elite dynamics that are partly responsible for why we are in the mess we're in today. There's a certain slice of leaders now who, when confronted with the reality of the path we are likely on, they simply don't want to either take it seriously, or they take it seriously and they don't want to talk about it because they realize it's kind of depressing. If you sketch up a vision of a future in which our economies are devastated, where societies are going to be deeply unhealthy and unstable as you see slowing economic growth, rising political populism, growing nationalism, the international political effects, everything you just sketched out. Why is it global order has broken down in our lifetimes? It's because things that started domestically have flowed over borders and are now having huge international effects. Some people just don't want to talk about that because they realize it is so overwhelming. And it's very inconvenient to be a leader in the 21st century, I tell people. You have to take this seriously because the future is arriving. We've still got a very narrow window in which to shift it. If you don't want to take any action this decade, though, you are not going to like the next decade.
How many people like you are there then? Because, a cynic in government might say, well, this chap, he's obviously touting for work. He's just set up a think tank. He's telling us how terrible everything is going to be so that we hire him to tell us how to solve it.
Genuinely, I'm just going to say this very bluntly. Pre-IPO Facebook and SpaceX, I'm really not touting for work. If anything, I've gone down this path because, actually I want to invest the rest of my life in a mission which is all about equipping the rest of us to be successful. I could do just fine not doing any of this. I could go and have a very nice life for myself. Unfortunately, it's very inconvenient. I don't want to live in a world in which we leave people behind. Coming from the kind of background I come from, I care deeply about ensuring that there is a true ladder of opportunity for people, not just in our country, but all over the world. And I think the effects will be devastating for every nation, not just for ours. And so I really couldn't care less if the reaction of cynical incumbents and people who've presided over the dismantling of our systems, the retreat of our values, think, oh, wow, this is some self-serving scheme. Your time is almost up. And it's very unfortunate, but my time's almost up too, because I live in the society that I care about, and we've all genuinely got to change course now. So that's what I'm focused on.
So, I mean, tell me a little bit more about where you come from and how you ended up doing what you did.
Yeah, my dad was a child refugee from Burma during the Second World War. He grew up in a refugee camp in Calcutta in India, came to the UK in the late 1950s. My mother was an immigrant from Malaysia. She came to the UK in the 70s to be an NHS nurse. And
so was he an Indian in Burma or a Burmese?
That was interesting, actually. His
my dad was an Indian in Burma.
Yeah.
In the Second World War, and was also a refugee.
Right. His father's side of the family were, a long time earlier, Scottish. And so they were part of that whole migration, with the British Empire, going into India. He had a very, very mixed background. He was somebody who...
So ethnically?
Yeah, I mean, he was somebody who, when I was a kid growing up in the UK in the 80s and 90s, there were people who would, yell names at him walking down the street because, he was not white, and we lived in a pretty rough neighborhood. And, when I was a kid, people would come up to me, and we were some of the only folks in our town in Kent who weren't white. And so, yeah, it was an environment in which, we had this very mixed heritage, and it was hard to explain it, but we were definitely outsiders from the beginning.
And so why did you want to embark on making the world a better place? And why did you choose tech as the place to do it?
Technology should be something deeply hopeful. It is something that is critical for our progress as societies. There's a reason we all use smartphones and social networks and internet services and AI. They're truly valuable. They're things that could genuinely, I think, have transformational, positive impacts on the world in our lifetimes. There's lots of things that AI is doing. There are lots of things coming from big tech which actually might make our lives vastly better. But at the same time, you can't ignore all the devastating consequences of what happens when you mismanage using those technologies, when you focus only on this story about how technology changes the world, but not how the world changes technology. What happens when the most powerful tech in history arrives in a world that's already broken, that's retreating in our lifetimes, as you noted. So for me, as somebody who went through a journey where, look, my life, I went through extraordinary an extraordinary journey, and I was part of the tech industry, and I got to climb that ladder of opportunity. That's fine, but now every day I think, what is the world gonna be like? What kind of ladders are we gonna provide for the billions of other people and the tens of millions of people in the UK who have not got opportunities and haven't had opportunities for quite a while and haven't had hope? And you see just how angry the mood has become, how disconnected people feel from each other, how atomized our population, and that's not the world I want to live in.
Do you think tech companies are controllable?
Yes.
These big private giants, which are hugely wealthy. How?
Another one of the observations I have after all these years working with these folks, I think a lot of people have tricked themselves into thinking that these companies are too powerful to be stopped. Their power is deep but very narrow. You're up against the power of sovereign nation states who have control of laws, who have massive economies in some cases, certainly have enormous societal influence. You have communities where we get to vote with our feet, in how these products operate, how publics react to technologies, the mood amongst the public absolutely has an impact on how these companies operate. But a lot of leaders have looked at the interests of big tech, and they've looked at the interests of communities, and they've said, it's just easier to go along with cutting deals with big tech. And I actually think, no, you need to be able to stand up for the true interests now of the people that you represent. And you'll find very, very quickly that actually the companies are petrified of getting into a position.
But the threat has to be, we'll shut you out, doesn't it, ultimately? Mm-hmm. And do you think governments should say that explicitly? Could they? Could the British government say to Meta, Google, TikTok, if you don't play by our rules, we're going to ban you?
there are countries which did ban TikTok. The UK government has just announced a ban on social media for young people. Of course, there are really powerful tools at our disposal. I think there's lots of ways you can get companies to play ball before you've even got to that point. But absolutely, I think now is the moment in which governments need to really, say, we are in a situation now where the companies are becoming almost untouchable. We have to show that we're willing to fight for the things that we care about.
We've started also seeing in AI in the last few days, the American government saying, well, we're going to ban Anthropic from selling products that we think are very powerful outside the US. I mean, are we entering a world in which there will be leagues of rich and poor countries who have different levels of access to this technology, and that's, I mean, not just rich and poor countries, but rich and poor people within those countries?
There will be a world coming in the next 10, 15 years where a tiny sliver of countries and ecosystems have access to ultra-powerful AI, commercial quantum computing, nuclear fusion, advanced robotics, a whole bunch of technologies that are central to economic competitiveness, to the functioning of our societies. Most of the rest of the world will not be inventing those technologies and may well not have access to those things except in exchange for very transactional deals, which will be foisted upon them by Washington and Beijing. That is exactly what the Anthropic developments in the last few days have illuminated, I think, for a lot of leaders around the world. And ever since the start of this year, as you've seen, the increasingly aggressive, transactional way in which the Trump administration has dealt with its allies, this is what I think a lot of leaders in Europe are thinking about in particular. We will not get access to those technologies except in exchange for something. Hand over your minerals, rewrite your trade rules, rewrite your entire societies to suit the interests of those other powers.
So what is the right response to that? Does Britain need its own? Does Europe need its own? What is the right response, do you think? You see, the British government said, well, this is a good job that we're investing more than £1 billion in AI because we've just seen what's happening to restrict our access. £1 billion sounds like a lot of money, obviously isn't in AI development terms, and it's not going to get us out. It's not going to get us out of the problem.
That's right. Just this year alone, US big tech is spending more than $650 billion on AI infrastructure. Elon's company just became worth more than $2 trillion. So no, that's not going to work on its own. Some of those things are valuable and we should be doing them, but the real path towards actual resiliency and for ensuring that we have a seat at the table when it comes to accessing these technologies and sharing in the wealth that will be created by them, we will need to come up with a shared agenda with lots of other middle powers. Loads of other countries are in the exact same position.
To control those companies.
Exactly.
So why isn't the answer, a British state-owned tech company that offers, the same services?
Oh, I think there's no universe in which you're going to be able to leverage the kind of resources you need to do that as one country. Lots of governments are trying to pull off national champions. In France, for example, Mistral, is their sort of AI national champion.
And China are doing it, obviously.
Sure, and that might work. You might get a few individual companies. We should obviously be doing whatever we can to boost domestic entrepreneurship and having amazing innovations in our ecosystems. But fundamentally, we should also be thinking much more ambitiously, how do we share compute and resources with other like-minded nations who recognize the threat that is coming from dependence upon the US and China, and figuring out diplomatically, geopolitically, how do we align our different nations so that we have a real bloc that is going to be competitive and that will be able to sit at the table and say to the US and China, you have to come through all of us. You're not going to pick us off one at a time in exchange for our minerals.
When you look at the current political landscape, are you at all hopeful?
I think there are honestly far more people who I worry about than give me hope in the current political ecosystem. There's a tremendous amount of bad thinking. There are a tremendous number of irresponsible actors who, again, partially illuminate some of these problems, but do not truly recognize the peril we're in or the need for a real serious, mature international response to these things.
I mean, when you look at the way a crypto billionaire has been able to finance the Reform Party and the leader of the Reform Party personally, what does that tell you about the vulnerability of British politics to players in tech with huge amounts of money.
I mean, in a way, it sort of confirms my thesis, which is all of our dysfunctions now and our solutions are international. The bad ideas and the movements and the infrastructure that is powering all these different political movements, they're things that are flowing in many cases through the United States, also touching other parts of the world. A lot of people who believe in a very different set of values, and folks coming from the mainstream parties, they didn't do the work to truly internationalize or tap into the support, the resources, the ideas that also could be flowing across ecosystems. And so this is something now where I'm not surprised at all. It's a reflection of the fact that everything, including politics, has become internationalized in the 21st century.
I feel we've just scratched the surface, but it's been a very good conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Dex, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.